Hey everyone, Anthony Venuto here with InTouch Mortgage Solutions. It's Friday, Finance Fridays, and on this episode we're going to be talking about the Liberal government cabinet shuffle, what Justin Trudeau said about housing and their federal responsibility, and we're going to talk a little bit about the federal, provincial, and municipal responsibilities and what this housing crisis could mean for Canadians moving forward, and you don't want to miss it, so stay tuned. Let's get right into it. I want to take an opportunity right now as we've been getting a lot of questions and concerns around what is happening with the federal government, what Justin Trudeau said about their responsibility when it comes to housing. More importantly, this cabinet reshuffle where we saw a new individual. We saw Sean Fraser take over as the Housing and Infrastructure Minister. Previously, he was in the immigration space, was shifted over, and then we saw Mark Miller come into the new immigration role. And we'll talk a little bit more about their sentiments in just a moment. But more importantly, obviously looking at the federal government, what the role of the federal government is, at least in my opinion, the provincial and municipal governments, and maybe you'll agree or disagree. First and foremost, I want to show Canadians what the clip was, just in case you haven't seen it. Here it is.
We're facing a real challenge around housing in terms of supply. There's simply not enough places for people to live right across the lower and middle income spectrum. And I'll be blunt as well. Housing isn't a primary federal responsibility. It's not something that we have direct carriage of, but it is something that we can and must help. So from the time we got elected in 2015, we were committed to building a national housing strategy, which we announced in 2017, and in continuing to be there to layer in and show up. But you're right, it's not just the federal government that can solve this.
Now, obviously with Justin Trudeau making that statement, he is somewhat correct. He is stressing the points that there are major shortfalls in the housing. We're facing economic challenges when it comes to lower income households. Obviously, we are in a very precarious situation here in Canada, especially when it comes to immigration and housing. So first and foremost, yes, the federal government doesn't have the same role as the municipal and provincial government when it comes to zoning bylaws and actually getting homes built, right? He's right there. But obviously the federal government is responsible for funding. They want to double the housing starts in Canada, and they need to collect the data. Obviously, here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. Where you think about the federal government, obviously they are responsible for Indigenous, vulnerable, homelessness, these national housing strategies that are very important to each provincial and municipal government, right? So there's the guideline. Then you have to look at CMHC, you have to look at the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Well, that's under direct purview of the federal government. The data collection, the programs to create a purpose-built rentals. So for investors that want to build these purpose-built rentals, they can go to CMHC and get potential funding. They also allow Canadians with less than 20% down to purchase. They set the requirements for the insurance based on the guidelines, and they report back to the government. And obviously there's a lot of data there because we hear a lot of statistics about housing and mortgages from CMHC. So they are important as well. Also, we have to look at OSFI, the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions. Now, although there's less of a role here, at least in my opinion, OSFI does regulate the banks. So they are the regulator to the banks, and they are recently under the limelight when it comes to these extended amortizations, these negative amortizations, and they're putting a lot more pressure, just as a side note, putting higher capital requirements on banks that are allowing amortizations to extend very long, like 70, 80, 90 plus years. So we'll see how that plays out. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel if you want to find out more about that. Don't forget to hit that notification bell, subscribe, make sure you like the video and leave those comments. But obviously OSFI is in the mix here. You have the federal budget, as I said, that came out in 2023, and my tying in this to the OSFI and how it's happening is you have the FCAC, the Federal Consumer Agency of Canada, right? Federal Agency of Canada, stating that they monitor consumers. Consumers need to be protected. These extreme circumstances, that was part of the federal budget. So there's a lot of ingredients in the pot right now when it comes to the federal government and what they can and cannot do, how they can influence certain directions. But yes, the federal government cannot actually force the provinces to do certain things and municipalities to do those other things as well. What are those things? Well, let's look at Ontario quickly. We saw the Ford government try to initiate this removal of conservation area, the Greenbelt. They wanted to open up some of this land, replace it with other lands in other parts, but they wanted to build. And just recently, obviously, they are under the gun as some of the potential flaws in this agreement favored developers. Not many people didn't see that one coming, right? Like, who's going to benefit from opening up this land for developers to build houses, so on and so forth. Anyway, that's aside from the point. Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. But regardless, this is a provincial thing where they're trying to make these moves to get housing built. Then you have municipal governments like Toronto, for example, where we saw the new mayor, Olivia Chow, first of all, plea with Torontonians to open up their homes to house these new refugees that are basically encamping themselves in parks, tent cities that are popping up. But more importantly, she's calling out the federal government because it's like, this is your policy that you want to bring in all these people at the tune of around 500,000 per year. We just hit 40 million Canadians in Canada. So, where do you want us to put these people, and are you giving us adequate funding? And maybe the government is giving adequate funding, but what's happening with that funding is, I guess, another question, right? So as you can see, this is a very complex issue, but all these levels of government need to work in harmony in order to assure that they can address the concerns for the Canadians. And I think a lot of Canadians at this point have had enough. Now, when you look at the criticisms, it's important to understand that, not each side of the aisle is going to be on board, and, they each have their own flaws. I believe, realistically speaking, that even if a new government was to be elected, although they may be ambitious, it would be very challenging to remedy a problem that's been decades in the making in just a few short years, maybe 4 or 8 years. Obviously, when you look at housing starts, where we're so far behind and where we need to be at 3.5 million, and we're building just as of June starts, 281,000 and change. And prior to that, we were much lower. So some of the statistics are basically like 4 to 5 new migrants to Canada. For every 4 to 5 new migrants, there's only one house being built. The question is, what kind of house is being built, right? So there is a lot of conversation around the responsibility of the government, and a lot of them are just pointing the fingers and passing the buck. Which brings us over to, the role of our new ministers. Obviously, we look at Sean Fraser coming from the immigration side into housing. Obviously, he potentially had a big hand to play in the boost in these immigration numbers. Potentially, he was just in that role.
But the project before me now is much broader than any one particular group. Everybody in Canada needs housing.
Housing, Minister?
Look, it depends what fixing housing means. It's not the same answer to everybody. I think we're going to be able to achieve meaningful progress, and hopefully quickly, to help ensure more Canadians have a roof over their head, and more people who are having trouble getting into the market can think about a place they might be able to own for themselves, can think about being able to afford rent so they can continue to work and live in the communities that they call home. It's not easy, but it's a job worth doing.
New housing starts are struggling though, so how are you going to change that? How are you going to influence policy that'll get more houses made?
There's no silver bullet here. We need to look at all the different policy levers we have, and we need to look at the incentives we can create to trigger communities to use the policy levers that they hold.
So I would assume that now he's looking at it from the housing perspective. He remains very optimistic on the plan that we can get to work in Canada. Although his agenda, his plans are very, very vague, to say the least. He is optimistic that with stabilization in inflation coming back down, and interest rates leveling off, we're going to see this housing crisis subside a little bit. We have noted that National Bank, I think, pointed to over the last little while that housing has become a little bit more affordable. Although many of you will probably comment on this. Obviously, it's not me making the data, it's National Bank. But I don't see affordability on housing getting better anytime soon, especially with higher interest rates for longer. Many Canadians feeling the pressures of still these elevated food prices and energy prices. We'll see exactly how those things play out. But yet, as I mentioned, Sean Fraser arguing that we still need, potentially to address this concern by introducing more inventory, addressing not necessarily the demand side, because the demand is there. We know immigration, we know that within 5 years, a lot of these new to Canada individuals who can't afford it will begin to purchase homes. They do need a place to live, they need a place to rent, and we just don't have enough places in the country right now to house these individuals. Then we look at Mark Miller, who is now the immigration minister, And his argument is that we need to basically add jet fuel to immigration. We need to balance out the economy over the long run. We need to up those immigration numbers, or at least keep them the same. So there's this argument happening right now is do we have enough? Do we need more in order to balance out immigration in the near future? And as I said, it's like adding jet fuel to the economy, to the growth of Canada. And I think they're projected to be around 100 million Canadians by the year 2100. And although that doesn't seem like a lot, obviously it is a very aggressive target. Canada has seen a very large population boom. So we're all basically in for a ride, the way I look at it right now, to see exactly how this will all play out. Obviously there are criticisms from the Conservatives when you look at what Pierre Poilievre is saying. And as I mentioned, we're not here to talk politics left or right. I think housing is a bipartisan issue. But the criticism from the Conservatives is that since the Liberal government has sort of been elected in 2015, have they addressed the concerns? The First-Time Home Buyers Act, the First-Time Home Buyers Incentive, I should say, the First Home Savers Account, all these other strategies that have taken so many years to be deployed, and the epic failures. It's the criticisms from, for example, I think it was an Abacus poll that was just done. It stated that 61% of Canadians believe that immigration is too high. 37% or 38% believe that it's excessively too high. And obviously this is having a negative impact on the Canadian housing market and obviously on Canadians themselves. So, with those polls, the data, we're looking at all these things in conjunction. We're going to be in for a definite rocky ride. Obviously optimistic on what happens with inflation and interest rates, as that could spur further development. It may incentivize builders to build more, but obviously they're in some regards, the keys, they hold the keys to building, and we have to make these conditions potentially more favorable to allow more homes to be built, more programs to maybe fund these homes, maybe really checking on what's happening with the funding from the federal government to the provincial to the municipal, especially when it comes to addressing affordable rentals. So let us know your comments in the comment sections below. What do you think is happening with this cabinet reshuffle? You think it's actually going to fix anything, or is it going to be the same thing until we have to have a new election come in 2025? Let us know below. But once again, we invite you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Make sure to like the video, leave a comment, hit the notification bell. But we'll see you next week. Thanks again for clicking. Have a great weekend.